Hello and welcome to another tutorial. My name is Ricardo Silva and today we're going to be talking about animating text in After Effects. For the moment I'm going to create a composition. So to do that without any element in my project, I'm just going to go to the composition menu and select New Composition. In here I can select what type of composition by using a preset or putting the width and height. I already have 1920 by 1080, which is exactly what I want, but I want to lower the frame rate to 24. So I can go to 23976 or 24. Right now I have 150 frames, so I'm going to make this 10 seconds. And 10 seconds by the frame rate, that means I need 240 frames, because every second has 24 frames. So now I'm going to give it a name in here. So I'm going to call this text animation. And I'm going to put a number in there, 01, so I know exactly what I'm doing. And I'm going to say OK. So now I have my composition, my timeline down below here. And you can see that I have a black background. Many people think that the black background is going to render black, but in reality, the black background in here represents right now that there is nothing in there. The way that I can see that is by going into my transparency grid in here and enabling that. I can see that in reality, that black color disappears and I have this grid of gray and white little squares. This is basically telling me that the black that I had just a moment ago was not necessarily a solid color that can render. I could render black if I add a solid black. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to go to the layer and create a new solid. In here, I'm going to select the button that says Make Comp Size because I want the solid to be the same size as my composition. So that is 1920 by 1080, and of course I'm going to click on the color swatch in here and select a black and say OK. Now when I select that and I have my grid enabled, my transparency grid enabled or disabled, I can see that this solid is actually an element that is not letting the transparency come through. Only when I move it away, you can see that it's in there. Alright, so that is perfectly fine. I'm going to lock that layer by clicking on the lock button down here in the timeline. And that black solid now is going to stay there. Whenever you create text, you have to go to the text tool, and that is right here at the top. And there are two different ways of creating text. One way is by clicking and you're going to drag and create a box or a paragraph box. That means that you can type in as many letters as you want, and that box behaves as a paragraph, that whenever you are going to reach the end of the paragraph, then you can continue typing like I'm doing here, but then your text is somewhere down there hidden. So in order for me to see the rest of the text, I'm going to have to double click on the icon down here in the timeline of the text. I double click on the letter T of the icon, and then I just grab this bottom area of the box and I just extend it, revealing the text that was inside that box. Now this is one way of doing it. Another way to create the text element, one way is by clicking and then start typing. So you can type in whatever you want in there. This one doesn't have any limitations. So if you keep on typing and typing and typing, it's going to create a complete line, unless you press return and then you create a second line. So in this particular case, we are creating text that has no limitations per se. So now that I have created this text, I'm going to type a word, maybe a typography here, so we can actually take a look at how we can animate or move this text. Some of you may be wondering why I have my text that looks a little pixelated there. The reason for that is because right here in my resolution, down sample factor pop-up, I have it in quarter. So I can go ahead and select the full resolution, so my type is going to look as sharp as possible. Also, my scale of my canvas is fit to up to 100, and right now if I let go, I can see that the size of that canvas is 57.5. So in other words, if I wanted to see it at 100% pixel size, then I can select the 100% in there, and now my typography looks very, very sharp. I'm going to go ahead and select the fit up to 100 because that way I can see the canvas entirely in the window. The most basic way to animate this type of text is by going into the parameters of transformation. So if I disclose this little triangle, you can see that I have a transform parameters or group of parameters in here. I have the anchor point, the position, the scale, the rotation, and opacity. So every single layer contains the position keyframes that I can enable there and move that at any different location in my canvas there, and I can see that I just created that simple animation. At the same time that I am applying the position keyframe, I can scale my text. So for example, right here I can start at 80%, and in the next keyframe, or even at any other time, I can make it to be 163%. So now you can see that not only the position is being animated, but also my scale. I think we have seen this before. The rotation, the same thing, so I could go ahead and move a little bit of that value there to add my first keyframe, and then right here at the end, maybe I can reverse that rotation, and now I have a completely brand new rotation and transformation of my entire element. If I add the opacity to this mix, I can start at 0, and I would say the opacity should come up a little earlier than the other keyframes, so I can see that my opacity just comes in and we see the effect of the rest of the transformation animation. Alright, so that is one way to animate text, and that is the most simple way to animate it. So I'm going to just click on reset in here and make sure that everything is turned off, and click reset again to make sure that my typography text is completely brand new again. If you notice under typography in the layers here, there is an animate menu. There is a little tiny, and it has a little arrow pointing to the right, encircled in a white dot. If you click in there, you can see that you can animate several parameters for this particular element. So let's go ahead and select the position first. When I do that, notice that the transform parameters, they stay the same way as before. They are reset, just like before. So I can close them. This animate parameter over here gave me a new position transformation that is part of something called the Animator 1. The Animator 1 didn't exist before I clicked on the animate that. So let me just undo that, and you can see that I don't have anything in there except the position of my transform group. So only when I go to animate and I select position, I can get an Animator 1 in here, and then I get a range selector and a position parameter. This position parameter basically is telling me that I want to animate this element in the position only. The way that this animator works is that you have to go to the range selector, and then you're going to select what range of the text characters you want to animate the position for. So right now you can see that the range goes from 0, start, to 100%. And that means the entire text. So whatever I do here in the position, the entire text is going to be moved, as in the position parameter. But if I select a different end or a different start, let's say I'm going to change the end selector to 50%, you will notice that there is a line going in the center, and now I have two different elements. I broke my typography text in half, and that means that I am animating only the 50% that I'm telling the range selector that I want to move it. So if I want to increase the range of the selection, notice that the more, when I move the range, the letters, they travel from one place to the other. So once again, if I leave it at 50%, only half of my text is being affected by this position parameter. I could leave this in 100, that means everything is going to be affected, but then my start could be 50%. So that means the first part of my text is not being affected, as you can see there. So the range selector in this particular case takes care of what parts of my text are going to be animated by this new position parameter. So I can do all this. So now that I have the control of what parts of the text are going to be animated, I can do specific things. One of those things that I can do is use the offset. The offset right now, as you can see, is 0%. That means that it's taking the range value from 50 to 100 as it is in there. But if I start offsetting those values using my percentage in here, you will notice that I am now moving the offset, meaning that I'm changing that 50% difference, and now I am animating this element in this fashion. So you can see that if I go all the way to minus 100, then basically the 50 to 100 is not even being affected, because now I have an offset that goes into the negative of 100. So that's how I would animate this element using my offset parameter. Now that is a very interesting part of this animator, but I'm going to go inside the advanced parameter grouping here. And this is a little more complicated, as you can see here. So don't get overwhelmed, don't get scared of seeing so many little elements in there and parameters and drop-down menus and all that stuff. That's not a problem, because I'm going to make sure that you understand at least most of them. The units, as you can see here, is talking about percentage. That means it's 50% of the text or 100% of the text. You can change that by going into the index. And when I go to the index, then it's going to look at every single character as one index. So if I say that I want to go from the first character, which would be 0, to the last character, which in this case would be, let me see, when I move this, I can see that line moving around. Okay, so if I say 8, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 14 right there. So it's 14 the end value in here. And now I can, the offset is also in characters. So I can move my offset. And if I say the offset is going to be 14, so that means that nothing in here is affected. So I have to move the offset to 0 in order for the entire element to be affected by my position parameter in the animator. So in many cases, I recommend that you keep them in percentage. So that will be easier to understand, because now we're looking at the entire word as 100%. The advanced tab also shows that it is based on characters, but you can select different other options. I'm going to leave it in characters. I want you to experiment later when you have different words or an entire paragraph in there, so you can affect every single word separately. The mode is a mathematical operation, meaning that we are adding this position to the elements that we are selecting here in the range selector. But you can then select different other modes. And again, this is something that you are going to experiment with. If I just change it to subtract, you will notice that it changes the values of my selection range, because I am subtracting instead of adding. So experiment with that. I usually keep it in add, because I don't need additional confusion to this already complex animator. So I'm just going to leave it there. And the amount, I'm going to leave it also as 100, because if I go down to 0, basically I am reducing the amount of change that I am applying to there. So again, I never use the mode or the amount, because I can control that with the actual position or the offset. Now the shape is something really important, and this is something that is not very well defined here, because it uses names that are not necessarily visually intuitive for every single person. But in general terms, square means that it jumps, it changes the angle really abruptly. That's why when I get the selection that is going to be animated, notice that typography is divided in a chunk of one text at the top and one text at the bottom. But if I say ramp up, meaning that there is going to be a curve or a soft change between one part or the other, then we are going to see a small decline of that animation. And if I also do the ramp down, then it's going to be in the opposite direction as well. So these elements are a little unintuitive, I would say. At this moment, I'm going to be using ramp up. Now, the other elements that are going to affect how this typography goes from one location to the other is the E is high or E is low. And the E is high, what it means is that it softens the curve in one side. And if I move to the other value, I'm going to put this in 0. If I go to the E is low, as you can see, it changes how the type is going down there. And if I do both at 100, then I get this effect that basically both E's are fighting against each other. So it's not a good idea to have them both at 100. Maybe you want to make them less than 100 so they can look like smooth on one side and smooth on the other, but in the middle there is sort of like a transition in the movement. So how would you animate something like this? Well, as I said earlier, once you set up your advanced elements in here, my rule of thumb is to use the units as percentage, to use the shape as a ramp up or ramp down, and also to do a little bit of this is high or just leave them in 0. The animation is going to happen by closing the advance. So in this particular case, the way that I'm going to animate this is that I need to select a range of characters that I want to animate first. As I mentioned before, I am selecting from 0 to 100. That means that I'm selecting all of the characters. That's why all of the text is trying to move to the position that I put in here in the position parameter. But to animate it properly, I need to select a start and an end. I usually leave the start at 0, and then the end, I'm going to select, let's say, probably like a 25% or something like that. And then what is going to be animated and keyframe is going to be the offset. So if I want to go completely from the bottom here, I just go to -25 on my offset, because that is the end value or the end range. So I just make sure that nothing gets animated at the first keyframe. I move my timeline indicator, let's say to frame 30 right there, and then I'm going to move my offset to probably 75 or 80, or in this case 97, 99, 100. There you go. So making sure that every single letter has gone all the way to the top. So this is how I am animating this element. So if I put my preview range down here, pressing the N letter in my keyboard, and I'm going to do a preview by going to my preview menu here and clicking the play stop and making sure that I have the loop in there. I can see that my typography text is moving from the bottom, the position that I selected here, to the top, just by keyframing only the offset. Now I'm going to add a rotation to this animator as well. So in front of the animator 1, I have an add button that looks very similar to the animate at the top. So that means that I'm going to continue selecting this same range for this whatever I add in here. So I can go here and I can say I want to select a property. In this case, maybe the property is going to be scale. So the scale right now is 100. That means it will scale from 100 to 100, right? Well, in reality, I want from 200, which is going to be in here. I'm going to type in 200 there. And that by itself is going to animate from that scale to here. And why? Because I am still inside the animator 1, and this position and this scale are using this range and these properties that I set up in the advanced. If you wanted to animate that in a very different way, I would go into the animate menu and then add a scale parameter. I'm not going to do that right now. I don't want to confuse what you're learning right now. But what I want to do is kind of like optimize, make this animator 1 a little better. So now I'm going to add the, let's see, maybe I can use a tracking. Tracking is the space between the characters. So I'm going to select tracking, and it's going to be a tracking type before and after. So I'm just going to leave it the way it is by default. But I want to make sure that here in the first keyframe, my tracking amount is larger, so I can read the word typography. I can even go beyond if I want to, right? But I want to make sure that I can read it. So I'm going to make it 80 right there. And that means that this tracking amount also is going to use the range selector that I set up in here. It's going to use the offset keyframes, and it's also going to use the advanced settings that I did in here. And that is because the tracking is part of the animator one. Okay, so it's going to use exactly that. So it's going to do something like that. This is the animation that is happening right there. Okay, it looks a little strange, but that is what it's doing. So I'm going to do a preview on that, and this is the effect that I get. Okay. Can I add a rotation for this particular element? Yes. I can go to Add, Property, Rotation, and then I can say I want to rotate starting here, maybe around that, like 25 degrees. So when I move my timeline indicator, notice that every single character rotates from 25 degrees to 0, one after the other. Now keep in mind that this line, this red line that is right now between the G and the R, that is the offset that is traveling through the keyframe in here. If I were to move this offset right now, notice that that line becomes in a different location, and of course it adds another keyframe. That's not what I want to do, so I select that keyframe and I just delete that. So now it goes back to how it was. The last thing that I want to add in this animator is going to be a property called the opacity. So the opacity, once again, right now, the opacity is 100. So it goes from 100 to 100, meaning that there is no animation. So I need to change that to something. So I'm going to change it, let's say, to 0. So it's completely opaque, transparent. And then you can see that those letters are showing up little by little, one after the other. At this point in the animation, I have my offset going okay. So I could make the range smaller or larger. So for example, if I make the start to be 0 and the end to be 10, that means I am making the range of characters that are animating a little shorter. So you can see that it feels like one character appears first, and then the other one, and then the next one, and so forth. So the animation is very individual in this case. Every single character seems to be coming into place one at a time. But if I increase my end range, let's say to 50 or 60, then you're going to see that the animation feels a little more smooth because there are more characters in the range that are being animated at this moment. Okay, that is great. Let's stop that. And now I'm going to add another animator. I am done with that animator right there. So I'm going to go like around in here, and I'm going to add another animate. Okay, so right here, I'm going to animate the scale. So as you can see, I have another animator, and that animator is already adding a scale. I do have a range selector as well, and I also have an advanced tab in there. So don't get confused with this animator because this is completely different to the first one that I have in here. I'm going to scale this element right here, starting at frame 30 or 40, and I'm going to increase my range, let's say to 90. So right here, when the typography ends in here, I'm going to wait, let's say 5 frames, like around here, 35, and I'm going to start my range of my animator number 2 to start there, and it's going to make every single character come forward with the scale parameter. So at this moment, I'm going to make this about, let's say, I'm going to make it 300%, so it's nice and big, and it's completely unreadable. But then in the range selector, I'm going to make it start from 0 to, let's say, 15%. And by doing that, then I can see that my red line for this animator number 2 is already there. So only the letter T became 200% already, but the Y and the P, the Y is not even close to that. So that's where the offset is going to help me. If I move my offset all the way like so, notice that the offset is moving that 15% throughout the entire text. So I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to go into the advanced once again, percentage, like I said before, I'm going to keep it that way. But instead of the shape to be square, I'm going to make it ramp up. And that's basically going to look something like that. Maybe the ramp down. Like I said, I use the ramp up or ramp down depending on the effect. So in this case, I want to start with the letter T to be larger. So whenever I move my offset, you will notice that every single letter is going to become that size. Perfect. So that is perfect. I think I like that. So I need to add a keyframe for my offset starting at -15. So I don't see any text larger at that moment. So add a keyframe. My timeline indicator is at frame 35, as you can see there. And then by frame 60 or 70, I'm going to make this, move this all the way to probably 100. There you go. So 100 right there makes it to go like that. Now, one thing that I want to make sure in this case is that I want everybody to read my text. At this moment, nobody can read it because everything is one on top of the other character. So what I want to do is also add a kerning. So for this animator number 2, I'm going to add a property for kerning. And that kerning, or I'm sorry, tracking. Kerning is when you do a pair of characters, and tracking is the entire line. So I'm going to do my tracking, and I'm going to go to the final keyframe because that's where I want to see how it is working. And I'm going to make it about there. Okay, so it's 125 or so. So I'm going to type it in correctly. So from here, now we know that this range offset is going to do exactly the entire element. And now I'm going to preview my entire 2 different animators. So the first one and then the second one. Perfect. Now at this moment, you could start experimenting with the shape inside of the advance of the animator number 2. The ramp down creates this effect, but if I were to do ramp up, it would be completely different. Okay, so it would be starting from big, small, the complete animation would change completely. The triangle is going to be really crazy right here because every single letter will pop out big and come down. The round is going to be, again, something similar to that, but it's going to look jumpy. And what about the smooth? It's probably going to be a little smoother, but not necessarily interesting. I can go into my range end and let's say make it 30, so it's a little smoother. There you go. But then in the beginning, my letter T is too big. So I need to make sure that right here at the beginning in this keyframe over here, I'm going to maybe make it -30 to make sure that the letter T is the size that originally typography was written with. And then now we have that smooth shape happening there. Like I said, I can use the ramp up or ramp down. And actually, in this case, is the ramp up to make sure that it actually works. I'm sorry, not ramp up, ramp down. So it actually works the way that I was intending this to be. Again, I can add another animator to make sure that my text is going away in a very elegant way. So right here at the end, you can see that my animation ends, but maybe I can overlap a little bit. Maybe I can go right here in frame 60. Not every single character is all finished, done with the scaling and tracking of the entire text. So I'm going to add right here in front of the text, animate, and I'm going to do just the opacity. When I do that, then I have the animator number 3 happening there, and I want the opacity to be 0. Okay. But I want to make sure that I do select a range. So maybe the range is going to be from 0 to 15, similar to the previous animator. So when I do my opacity, only that 15% is going to disappear. And guess what? I'm going to animate again the offset, starting at -15. I add a keyframe, and then overlap that, and make sure that at frame 90, my offset is all the way to 100. Go to the advanced and make sure that my shape is either this ramp up or ramp down, which ramp down is the one that it works. And I'm just going to type in N right there to make sure that I do a preview. I'm actually pressing the number 0 in my extended keyboard on the keypad. Perfect. So that is exactly the animation that I wanted. So as you can see, the animator is something very interesting to work. It's a little complex, so make sure that you do not concentrate on all of those parameters and get confused about them. Just follow my indication to use certain parameters because that would make your life easier. If you want to experiment with the other parameters, that's fine. That's okay. One other thing that you can do is, let me just stop this. And this one right here, the first animator basically is revealing my text. So I can select that, press the return key, and I'm going to call it the reveal. And I'm just going to put animator, the reveal animator. That's my reveal animator. What about animator number 2? Animator number 2 is make it big. So I'm going to make it big animator. Make it big animator. That way I can recognize and edit the elements that I know that are basically affecting my type. Right here on this one, I'm going to type in and make it reveal out. That's it. So now I can see all these elements. Let me just add the word animator at the end, so I know it's one of these animate elements. Alrighty, so this is basically it. This is the way that you animate type using the animator or the normal transform properties in here. Just keep in mind that these two elements, the transform and the transform inside your animators, are completely different. They're completely separate. Okie dokie. Well, this is it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.